Clear of the closing doors, please.
What up, son? What up? Louis Max, Grind and Pivot, pivotal moments that changed everything. Today, I have someone, and I got to be fully transparent, someone I know, but have not really spoken to for 45 years. That's right. Back in high school. Anyway, best-selling New York Times author, journalist, and TV producer extraordinaire, Queens, New York boy, straight out of 718. Bayside, New York. Keith Elliot Greenberg. What's happening, my brother?
Hey, Louis. And actually, we have seen each other much closer than 45 years ago, probably more like 35 years ago.
Right. Maybe 25. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, maybe 25.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk about that later on, where we actually met up. But beautiful. Dude, let's reconnect. It's good to see you. You look great. How you making out in this crazy world?
A little bit better than I feared. And I'm actually writing a book about pro wrestling in the time of COVID-19. As of this morning, I'm 206 pages in, probably have another 100 pages or so to go. So I have actually been able to let COVID fuel my creativity, and I'm grateful for that.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. You've written quite extensively on wrestling, and I'm a big fan. I want to just even bring up, I'm going to bring it in early so I don't have to do it later. I got a couple of books here, some of your favorites, I understand.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, two of my favorites that I've written.
Absolutely. Yeah. Pencil Neck Geeks, of course. And I got Blassie back here in honor of you.
Thank you.
But you've written quite a bit about WD and wrestling. We're going to get into that completely, but let's go back a little bit. Tell us a little bit where you're from, how you got into the whole writing and author and journalism, and where did it start?
Well, growing up, I thought I was going to be a cartoonist. I didn't think I was going to be a writer. And, I started taking classes at Parsons School of Design on the weekends. And I graduated high school early. So I was at Queens College. I was taking art classes at Queens College. And I realized I didn't really have the discipline to be an artist. Drawing things to scale were a challenge. When I would draw cartoons for my friends as a teenager or earlier, they would all laugh and they thought it was cool. But I realized it was a lot of work to do that. And I was a little bit worried because it's like, okay, so what am I going to do? I'm not going to be a lawyer. I'm not going to be, I'm not brave enough to be a firefighter or a police officer. I mean, the sanitation guys in the neighborhood always seemed relatively happy. So, maybe that was an option, but I did want to do something creative. And I realized I wasn't a bad writer. It didn't seem like work in the same way. So, I started writing about what I read. So I started writing porn. I started writing about wrestling, stuff that seemed to come natural. Sometimes I speak to a journalism class and these kids will ask me questions and they seem very smart, but they don't read. And so if you don't read, you can't really write.
Correct.
And so I read a lot,
you gotta read.
I read, when I was 19, I was writing letters for porn magazines. I read porn magazines. I actually read the porn stories in there.
So did I. I unloaded it, but I had a very big collection. It's funny. I just interviewed a guy from Show World in the city.
Wow, I remember.
And from the people, yeah, crazy. But and getting back to the magazines thing, yeah, that was a big thing. You probably went to Creamy Egg Cream over there and got your magazine.
Of course I went to Creamy Egg Cream where all the porn magazines were up, when you'd get an egg cream. But the thing was, and let's not besmirch that. And I know you don't. It's like the wrestling business or certain types of fringe music. There's an art to it.
100%.
And this is before people even had, VCRs. So,
right.
if they wanted to masturbate, they would read porn stories.
Absolutely.
And to write a 12-page story and evoke a reaction, doesn't matter what you're doing. You're trying to, get people excited.
Right.
And there is a craft to it. And that is a craft, obviously, with everything streaming, that people just don't do anymore. I'm not saying that people don't write erotica, but there were these magazines that were, porn factories.
Right. Now you're talking about like the magazines like Cherry,
I wrote, I was
Hustler,
a
and
staffer at Cherry. As soon as I started writing for Cherry at age 19,
I
but
didn't know that.
when I got out of college, I remember I was in college, and Carmine, who was the boss there, who, he's passed away, but I loved him. He gave me very brotherly life advice. And I've had the good fortune of being able to convey that to his children. But Carmine wanted to offer me a job, and I was still in college. And I thought, I'm so close to graduating college. I really should graduate college. Like my father didn't graduate college. And so I declined a full-time job at Cherry. And then I had to wait another year. I graduated college. I got a job at a business newsletter. And then Cherry came calling. And so I went over to Cherry. But while I was at Cherry, they were owned by the same company that owned Us Weekly. And they also, owned the same company owned Teen Beat magazine. So I would go next door and I would start pitching stories to these other magazines. And I was also writing for local newspapers, in particular the Bayside Times. And I was doing that simultaneously, when I was a kid. I was a teenager. I've been, making getting paid to be a writer for 43 years now.
Right. Amazing.
And, I would pitch stories, and a story I often tell is I went over to Us Weekly, and this is probably around 82, I'm guessing probably 1982. And I said, I want to write for you guys. And you're this young kid, this 23-year-old kid who works at the porno magazine next door. Why should we have you write for us? We have a whole staff of people. Some of these people I went to journalism school too, but they went to prestigious journalism schools. Why should we throw you a story? What do you know about that others on the staff don't know about? And I said, I bet I know more about professional wrestling than anybody here. And they gave me a shot. Right. And I wrote a story about Bruno Sammartino and his son, David Sammartino.
Okay.
David Sammartino was now wrestling, right, and Bruno was disappointed. You'd think he'd be honored that his son wanted to, follow his footsteps. But no, he wanted his kid to go to college. He was an immigrant and he had dreams for him. He didn't want him breaking his body down. And that story ran in Us Weekly. And that was a period when professional wrestling did not receive mainstream coverage.
That is correct. It was still the territorial, right? It was still very territorial.
It was the wrestling territories existed, and it was considered fringe entertainment. Normal people supposedly did not watch professional
right.
And so when professional wrestling ended up in a real publication, there was a lot of talk around that. And in the wrestling world, it got attention. And once I did that story, I remember one of my goals was, I want to grow up and, write for the New York Daily News, because we didn't read the New York Times in my house. We read the New York Daily News and the old Long Island Press.
Press, of course, yes.
And, I have the story in Us Weekly, and I call the Daily News, and I pitch them another wrestling story. And they're like, oh, sure, go ahead, do it. I'm like, well, what am I going to aspire to now? That was my goal 3 or 4 years. Really? Right. You want me to do it? And I remember, going to Madison Square Garden, and they let me in. I had a credential.
Press pass.
They actually let me go upstairs, and they let me go into the dressing room. And it's wow, I guess I can write about wrestling now.
Wow, that's
and
amazing.
It was pretty good.
Great story. Great story. How did the Menudo thing come about? Well, that was
That
one of
was
your
all
first
around the
books,
same
right?
period.
Around the
Yeah,
same
that
period,
was the
right?
first. So 83, I was 24 years old. So now I'm thinking I might want to write a book. It's like, and sometimes I meet people who are young and they're working somewhere, let's say, because I work full time as a TV producer, they're a production assistant, and they have these lofty goals for themselves.
Of course, absolutely.
And they're kind of pushed down, like you're a kid, get some seasoning. And you know what? I didn't feel like, getting the seasoning. I wanted to get seasoning in the field, on the job. And so I had a number of book ideas. One book I wanted to write a book about professional wrestling, but I couldn't get anyone really that interested in it. And at the time, I had an apartment in Hollis, and on the block, it was a lot of Black people, but also a lot of Hispanic people, people from Argentina, people from Colombia, Puerto Rican Americans. Well, Puerto Ricans are Americans, but, on the block. And, the kids were, I wasn't much older than these kids. And so the little girls on the block who are, I'm maybe, 23 or so, they're like 14. They're all talking about Menudo. And you and I were discussing this off camera. We grew up watching professional wrestling in Spanish on Channel 41. And so I knew some Spanish. And, I took it in school.
Right.
My grandparents owned a bodega in the Bronx, so I was around Spanish. And so I was reading their like teeny bopper magazines in Spanish. And I went back to Us Weekly and I pitched a story on Menudo. And they're like, yeah, that's great. And then Menudo hit it big. I interviewed Menudo and they hit it big. And now, from being like a pest who's going over there and bothering them, now I'm being perceived as a visionary.
You're the darling. You're the darling.
Because I was plugged into pro wrestling and I was plugged into Menudo.
Pop culture at that time, right? Pop culture coming about.
Yeah, it's all coming about. And I remember they said, what's going to be the next thing? And that I was wrong about. I said, roller derby's going to come back.
Oh, I wish. Mike Gammon, Charlie O'Connell, Joni Weston.
McGuire, right?
Oh, please.
I
wish.
Right.
I wish.
Who was from Queens.
Oh, yeah.
So now I write this story about Menudo, and the people who were in management for Menudo were delighted. Like, again, they were a Spanish group, and now they're getting mainstream attention in a major English language magazine.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so they have a tour of New York. Now they're starting to really make it big. And I get Teen Beat magazine, which again is owned by the same company that owns Cherry magazine,
It's crazy.
to let me, cover their tour. And they're delighted because they want to put cute boys in there for little like 11 and 12-year-old girls.
Of course.
And in the course of that tour, I meet one of the Menudo's cousins who's been taking pictures. He's like my age. He's been taking pictures. And I go, let's just do a book together on Menudo. And he has the pictures. I have the stories. And I don't even think I had, there was the Writer's Market or the Writer's Guide. It was this big, thick book you could buy every year.
Like a reference there?
A reference book.
Okay.
And it would list literary agents in there.
Yeah.
So I start like cold calling literary agents in New York and pitching them on this Menudo book. And I have now several Menudo articles that I've written. So one agent who was like 85 years old, she goes, let me see, I'll try to sell it. She calls me back like a day later. She goes, okay, Simon & Schuster's going to take it.
Wow.
So I'm like, well, this is kind of easy, And so now I was an author also. It happened all very fast.
That's amazing. How has the publishing industry changed now?
Well, you certainly couldn't cold call literary agents now. Although I don't have an agent currently.
Yeah, but you got that experience. You've been doing it for
right. So I can call
somebody new, somebody new that has a young Keith Greenberg How does a
Young people,
young
well, what
priest?
I always say, because people ask me that,
They do.
is write for anybody now.
I
I
was gonna
mean,
say, keep writing. Yeah.
keep writing, and there's blogs now. You don't necessarily have to get paid, but I
Yeah.
mean, if you love thrash metal, find a thrash metal website and start writing for them.
Right.
My oldest kid, who's transgender, Dylan Mars Greenberg, who's a filmmaker.
Yeah. Big ups.
They have, they've done a bunch of features, and when Dylan wants to publicize something, Dylan knows all these websites, of horror movies and alternative movies and underground movies. And there's always somebody who wants to write about that.
Right.
There's like newspapers, like when Dylan wants to publicize something, Dylan goes to AM New York.
I know. I know. I'm New York. Of course. It's a free paper. Right.
It's a free paper.
Yeah.
And they cover one of Dylan's projects.
So so what you're saying really then it comes down to what I'm saying it also as, it's funny. You ask how it's done. It's very difficult, let's say, to quote unquote make a living doing it.
You're not going to make a living. You're not going to make a living.
Right. You're not going to make a living. But if you go back to grassroots networking and sales, you can't necessarily, make the call, but you can continually reach out and somebody will.
And there are people who need writers who will work for free or correct. Next to free.
Next to nothing.
And exactly. Once you do that, I was in Bensonhurst. I was in a restaurant. And there was a woman there, and she's like, "Yeah, I'm getting started as a writer and as a photographer." And she goes, "Sometimes I drive up to this weekly newspaper in Scarsdale, and I sell some of my pictures there." She's getting her name out there.
Got to be willing to work, huh?
What?
You got to be willing to work a little bit.
You have to be willing to work, and if it's your passion, look. You tell me that you write music. I mean, so that's effort. You're writing music. Initially, you're writing it for yourself. You can put it up online.
Yeah, maybe put it up. We do. It's all out there. Yeah, that's changed quite a bit. You're not going to get that whole industry has changed because of the platform. But it's, I know that it's so difficult to even make money as a journalist now. It's hard. It's just harder. So that's why I wanted to get your take.
There are ways of doing it.
There are ways.
I'm saying there are ways. It depends how mainstream you are or are not.
Right. Or not, because in a way, the underground stuff sometimes blows up a little bit more because of the crazy niches. So you stayed in the music. You had the Menudo thing. Talk about a couple of the other books that you read. We're going to put all the descriptions down where you can get. I know. Well, let's talk about the John Lennon thing. How about that?
Okay. So the John Lennon thing took place in 2010. And a friend of mine, Mike Edison, who has written a bunch of books, who would be a great guest for your show. One of my favorite books of his. He's written two books I really love. Well, three. One is called Dirty, 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 about the sex industry. Another one is called I Make Friends Everywhere I Go, which is about his adventures working for porno magazines, wrestling magazines, High Times, and playing in punk bands. It's just a memoir. And then he has another book, which is to me the most powerful book, called You Are a Complete Disappointment, which is the last thing his late father ever said to him.
Wow! First, shout out to Mike Edison. He just got a promo and a half from Mr. Greenberg.
But he was working for Backbeat Books, and we were buddies. We had met at Dick Manitoba's bar.
Handsome Dick.
Yeah. So we had met there, a while before. And he said, we're trying to do a book for the 30th anniversary of John Lennon's death. And I said, yeah, fine, I'll do it. And, I was 21 when John Lennon died. And
Yep.
I decided to make it a very New York centric book. It wasn't quite like the documentary Lennon NYC, which was about his love affair with New York City. But it was very much a New York book about how John Lennon, unlike other people who were blow-ins into New York, he really did become a New Yorker.
He embraced it. He did. Yeah.
He went to the coffee shop. He was seen in Central Park. You could have an exchange with him in the street. He might have retreated from the music industry for a few years, but he did not retreat from the people. And he was regarded as a New Yorker.
Yeah.
And then to have somebody from outside the city come in and kill him was at the time a very shocking thing. And you remember it because, we're about the same age.
100%.
So
I remember going to the Dakota.
Right. Yeah. So, and again, that was very spontaneous. It's not like now on social media, some would post, hey, we're all going to the Dakota to pay homage to John Lennon. Here, people just went.
Yeah, they
like,
just did it.
After the book was written, my friend Bob Higgins, I was talking to his wife, she said she was like doing her homework, listening to WNEW. She finds out John Lennon died, and that morning she's getting ready to go to, I think she might have gone to the Mary Lewis Academy or something, the girls' Catholic school.
Yeah.
And instead of going to school, she just goes to the Dakota without anyone telling her to. And I spoke to one of the police officers for the book, and he goes, we sent like, 2 police cars. We figure, okay, maybe 100 fans will show up. They didn't realize tens of thousands of people just converged on the Dakota.
Yeah.
And there was something magnetic that drew them there. And they all wanted to grieve together at the Dakota. And you were one of them.
Absolutely. I did. I was dragged by an old girlfriend, but I did actually go. And I remember the big deal was waiting for Yoko to actually look out the window and wave. That was like a big
I don't think
deal.
that happened. Right.
And then I went to Hop Key in Chinatown,
right,
with my parents for dinner. We met them, but it was a different world back then. It really was. So that's interesting about that book. I know you've written some other music stuff, but let's move into the true crime end of your writing, because I guess it's kind of a segue from Lennon. You wrote about true crime early on as well, right?
Yes, I did. I was always interested in true crime. I was interested, it's like, for lack of a better term, maybe it's trash culture, serial killers, professional wrestling,
I love it. I love it all.
And porn, it's all alternative stuff. Now, that doesn't mean I don't grieve for the victims of these killers. I don't celebrate the murder.
No, absolutely, 100%. Absolutely.
And I've gotten to know, very dedicated detectives and, family members, some of whom have done very productive things and become victims advocates. So, I don't want to be flip about any of this.
Absolutely.
But there is a fascination with, the damaged mind.
That's what it is, fascination.
Yeah, and we all have fantasies about, when I was a kid, I used to say, wouldn't it be great if I went to Bayside High School with a rifle and just shot everyone?
Jesus.
Now, I didn't want to do it. I fantasized about it.
Right.
What if I went on the Throgs Neck Bridge with a machine gun and just, I certainly thought about those things, but I didn't do it. I imagined it. It was a fantasy.
Right.
But what makes a person cross that line? And now he's not dreaming about going onto the Throgs Neck Bridge with a gun, but actually kills people with no regard for life, regard for the lives he's impacted.
100%. That is a great question. I just got to interrupt. That is a great question, because that is the crux of a lot of the people that I've been talking to as well, and that have done time in prison or have been victims. I just wonder, like you're saying, you fantasized about it, you thought about it. Okay, well, back then it was a different game. But the thing is that, like, what really where does that line, where do you cross that line where someone says, I'm going to do these things? That's number one. And then I'm looking at even like young people. When we were younger, and I brought this up the other day to somebody, when we were younger, we'd hang out, we'd smoke pot, we get high, blah, blah, blah. We'd maybe drink a little bit, but I don't remember doing that and hanging out and saying, hey, let's go fuck something up. Let's go rob this person. Let's go kill somebody. It just never happened.
But I knew people who did.
Did you?
Yes.
Growing up?
Yes, growing up. Okay. Yes, I knew people who did.
Queens folk?
In Queens, because they would say, this guy's selling weed, let's rip him off.
Right.
Usually
That's-
with
yeah.
somebody who had
Yeah.
stuff they wanted, and it was generally, drugs or quaaludes. But certainly those folks were motivated to take what they wanted.
Interesting.
Now, I still talk to some of those people. My parents are in their 90s. They're still, well, my father's in his 90s. They're still alive.
God
and
bless.
they're in the neighborhood where I grew up. And, I talked to some of those folks, and they've actually explained to me what their mentality was at the time. And sometimes they feel guilty about what they did. Sometimes they just write it off to, this was the environment we were in.
I don't know about that.
I don't know if any of them boast about it in a way where they feel proud and they'd want their own children to do things like that.
Right.
But again, maybe it's a certain fearlessness. I also didn't want to rip someone off because I didn't want to take a hard punch to the face. I was afraid of that.
Right.
Maybe if you don't fear violence, and you can fight pretty well, you're not as scared of that.
Well, a lot of people also say that they come from certain backgrounds and they've only know how to resolve things with violence, and that's the only way they know.
I've heard that too, but what I've always been most fascinated about with true crime are the people who come from backgrounds that don't necessarily lead you to believe they're going to take that step. I mean, one of my true crime books, which is called Killing for You, the killer was an actor. He was doing dinner theater.
Which one was that? That wasn't the Ohio one, right?
No,
which
this
was
one took place in Orange County, California.
Okay.
Perfect.
Tell us about that.
But and I actually got very close to the victim's family. This was a guy, Daniel Wozniak. He was a dinner theater actor. If you can look up videos of him online when he's promoting his plays, and even though he's in Orange County, California, he's not doing theater in LA. It would be like, if somebody lived on Long Island and they were doing local theater in Long Island. So, he wasn't in Hollywood, just like someone who's doing local theater in Long Island isn't on Broadway.
Right.
But this is a guy with no violent past that I know of. People later on told me that he would work at a phone store and money would go missing. I couldn't validate that, but, not really somebody who had a history of violence. And he was strapped for money. He was about to get married, and he lives in this apartment complex. And this veteran moves in, a guy who just came out of the war in Afghanistan, this guy, Sammy, who was, very well liked, very loyal, quite courageous, according to the people who served with him in Afghanistan, comes from a lovely family. His mother's an Argentinian Jew. She was a Spanish teacher, and the father was a school teacher, and that's how they met. Good family. I met his cousins, and he just came out of the war, and somehow he's like hanging at the hot tub, and he mentions to this actor dude that he has a nice chunk of money from serving in the military. A lot of people tell stories like that.
Of course.
Daniel Wozniak's mind, he begins to think, well, how do I get that money? And so he comes up with this scheme. Again, he's an actor, which sounds like a movie script. He tells Sammy, I need you to help me move equipment. And they go to a theater, and he shoots Sammy when they're up in the attic. And then he beheads him and cuts his hands off because he thinks, oh, that's the evidence. Meanwhile, he leaves all his tattoos. He then takes Sammy's phone and he texts a female friend of Sammy, says, I'm depressed. Can you come over my apartment? I need to talk to you. I'm having family problems. And the girl comes over. He kills the girl.
Really?
Strips her clothes off, writes derogatory, hateful things all over her body, and leaves. So when the police come, they say, oh, this guy just got out of the war. He'd had some problems with
Yeah,
gangs and such when he was a kid.
Right. He flipped.
And he flipped and he killed this girl and he's on the run. No one can find him. And meanwhile, Wozniak gets one of his teenage students, like drama students, to start withdrawing money from Sammy's account. And that's insane.
It is insane.
And, you know, here's Wozniak, who up until a few weeks before had never been violent. So what was ticking? Was this guy always like that?
He was a quiet man. He was a quiet man.
Well, he wasn't quite quiet. He was, you know, a very theatrical guy who would talk with dramatic flourishes, but not a menacing guy by any means. So I still don't understand. And I met him when he was in jail. What was ticking in this guy's brain that he thought he could get away with that?
That's
and
crazy.
How does someone live for all of these years and no one sees a sign of that he's capable of murdering two people and not caring what he does to Sammy's family, not caring what he does to this poor girl's family.
Right.
You know,
what do you deduce? What's your deduction? What do you?
I don't know.
So
I
you still
don't
don't know. You
know.
still don't know.
Understand. I really don't understand.
Is he? Where is he now? Is he alive? Is he still
He's in
alive?
prison, of course.
No, I know that, but is he?
He was sentenced to death.
Okay.
He was on death row in California.
Okay. Let's get into the main crux of this conversation, where I've been a fan of yours for so long, unbeknownst to you, I'm sure. But like as you said, we did meet not only 45 years ago, but we met, you know, probably 20, maybe 25 again on a chance, because I've always been watching you. But you were involved with the WWE and wrestling for many, many, many years. Take us back to the beginning. We talked about a little bit before. You started watching wrestling like I started watching wrestling in the 70s. UHF, Channel 47, 47, right? 41, 41, right. Olympic Auditorium, Gordman and Goliath, I'm hoping, Jimmy Lennon. Shout out to my friend G-Man if you're listening, brother. You probably, it's Richmond 9. I forget.
Richmond 9, 5171.
There you go. Okay, so we got it. Now, fast forward to 2021, you're being featured on Dark Side of the Ring to a whole.
It was actually the A&E.
Oh, the A&E. That's right. I'm sorry. My bad. The A&E biography, and you know, I tell my friends. I know Keith. He's the man. You know, he's a star. So they kind of love it. But let's go back to your start of wrestling and how you gravitated to the passion. Who your favorites were? What were you into? Did you read? Did you get the magazines like I did?
Yeah, I and it's so funny because I've been writing for a British wrestling magazine called Inside the Ropes. You know, I was talking with two of the guys in the UK today, and they're younger than me, but they started out, you know, going to the store and buying wrestling magazines.
Okay.
And my friend Kenny McIntosh, who's, you know, one of the founders, said he remembers that he would then block off a chunk of time, like he couldn't do anything for a few hours because he had to read the wrestling magazine first. And, you know, I was like that too. I would go to the store and I would buy Inside Wrestling and The Wrestler.
Right. I had Wrestling World, right?
Wrestling World. I would buy Wrestling World.
PWI.
WI later on. I had a subscription to Wrestling Review.
Correct.
And
okay.
I'd read all of those and I would read them from cover to cover.
Me too.
And I didn't come from an educated background. So there would be times when I would see something in a wrestling magazine and it would make me curious about something else. Like Abdullah the Butcher was the wild man, the Sudan, but I didn't know anything about it.
One of my favorites. One of my favorites.
So I would go to the encyclopedia and look up the Sudan. And so wrestling was a gateway to knowledge for me.
That's interesting. Great point. Great point.
Yeah,
Who were your favorites back then?
Well, we mentioned, Freddie Blassie would name my favorite.
Me too. Okay.
And I ended up writing his book later on. with him. But, we talk about Gordman and Goliath. The story that comes to mind there was when I read Mike Tyson's autobiography. He tells a story about his mother having a fight with her boyfriend, and his mother starts boiling water to throw on her boyfriend. And Mike Tyson and the mother's boyfriend are watching wrestling. And so she goes, whoever's sitting there is getting scalded, but they don't feel like, getting up because they're watching wrestling. And so the mother throws boiling water on the two of them and scalds her own son. So a few years after that, I interviewed Mike Tyson. So when we were off camera, I said, who are you watching on TV? He said, Black Gordman.
Fantastic. Yeah, those really were the days. So what about on the other, like because the main promotion that we only saw really was the
Worldwide
WWF, World Wrestling Federation.
Worldwide Wrestling
Federation. So back in the day. So obviously San Martino Rivera, all
Right.
those guys, but there were many jobbers as well that we
Tomas Marin,
Tomas Marin, right?
Vicente Palmente,
right?
Sure.
Johnny Rod, Predictable.
Johnny Rods, Lee Wong from Hong Kong. Yeah,
Lee Wong, right.
Yeah.
Right. So you were up on, so you read the magazines kind of like I did, cover to cover, and then you got interested in the territories as well, right?
Yes. And I've written about this.
That's what I want to say. Tell
I've written a few books on professional wrestling, and now, I'm grateful because this magazine in the UK, Inside the Ropes, I have a column for them every month. So I just wrote an article about going to the most recent WrestleMania, and they had me write it in the first person. And I actually mentioned in the article that I never saw Dick the Bruiser on TV or live because Dick the Bruiser was banned from New York State after a 1957 riot in Madison Square Garden.
The riot. I remember the riot. Absolutely. That was big news.
So, you'd read about him working in Indianapolis in a wrestling magazine, and you'd say, wow, I wonder what it'd be like to see Dick the Bruiser wrestle, And I remember once having a dream that I saw Mad Dog Vachon wrestle, because Mad Dog Vachon at that point, I hadn't seen him wrestle in New York.
Right, so, Mad Dog, Butcher.
Right.
They were from Canada, right?
Yeah, they were from Montreal, but Canadian, they also worked in the AWA in the Midwest.
Yeah, Vern Gang.
So there were certain wrestlers that we didn't get to see, and we saw more than others because we also received TV from Los Angeles in Spanish. And later on, I remember receiving on UHF some Florida wrestling.
Correct. With Gordon Soley, the early Gordon Soley stuff, right? Yeah, that was great. I love that stuff. I love the stuff.
That was a crazy promotion.
Yeah, that was with Harley Race and Mike Grant.
Harley Race and Kevin Sullivan and Dusty Rhodes. And, that was, Vince McMahon, or Vince McMahon Sr., as he's known. That was Vincent James McMahon. The current Vince McMahon is Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Right. But Vincent James McMahon was more conservative than other promoters. So, there weren't generally fights at the announcers table. But Florida, it was Eddie Graham's promotion, anything went, So, if Vincent James McMahon was, say, George H.W. Bush, Eddie Graham was Donald Trump. Like anything else.
Okay. That was good. That's a great analogy. So you wrote that book called Too Sweet, right?
Too Sweet.
And that's that's really about the indies and the other promotions.
That's about indie wrestling.
That's good. We're going to put that down.
Inside the indie wrestling revolution.
That's fantastic. I got to read that.
So, and that's about indie wrestling. And I said, indie is like punk rock is indie, indie music, there in the hip hop scene, there's an indie scene, and often the indie becomes mainstream. ECW was in fact, ECW is mentioned prominently in the book because prior to what we now call indies, there were promotions known as outlaw
promotions. Correct.
And ECW was the ultimate outlaw promotion.
I got so hooked on ECW, and my kids did too. Actually, that's where it happened. But when they debuted, from Philly with the music and
Right, it was
Dreamer.
music like you
and
never saw that kind of music
You never
on
saw
a
that from
wrestling show, you
right,
know?
exactly.
Right? It
Yeah,
was
no,
heavy music.
it really was out of control.
Right.
And the music was great. The presentation was wild. We ended up going and I saw you. I believe I saw you at did I see
Was
you
it
at
the
the
Manhattan Center?
I forget where
Or
I saw
maybe
you.
it was in
It was
Queens.
in Elks Club, maybe
Yes, the Elks Club.
Elks Club. I
Elks
think I
Club
saw
on
you in the Elks
Queens
Club,
Boulevard.
right? And the fans were so passionate. Cactus, I think, was there that day when he
Yes,
gave that.
Cactus was.
Oh my God.
I went with my friend Dave Hogan, who was from Ireland. And so, America was a trip for him. And then watching Cactus Jack, I remember he did some move where he propelled himself off a chair, and he had no regard for his body.
None.
Because later
None.
on, when I met Mick Foley, he's a deeply intelligent man.
No doubt.
And,
No doubt.
and it was very hard to reconcile the man I was speaking to with the character I saw just throwing himself all over the place.
That's a great segue. When you're writing these books, the different books, what's your process with them? I mean, there's a thin line between you being a mark. They could play you,
Of course they can play me, and they have.
I'm sure. So what's the process? And it's got to be entertaining, right? I mean, these guys are really character. I mean, they really take the real ones.
It's their life.
Correct. And I get it because,
if you're a professional wrestler and it's not COVID, you're on the road 4 to 5 times a week.
Correct.
That means, and I remember the late Hercules Hernandez telling me this, that, he'd be on the road sometimes back then in the 80s for 2 weeks at a time. And then he'd have like 2.5 days at home. Because the first day, everybody'd be mad at him, resentful of him, because he'd been away from his family. So he'd go, "Oh, I didn't know that you're failing math." And, he'd get an answer like, "Yeah, if you were ever around, you might know a little bit more."
Oh, boy.
And then, the second day was okay. And then the third day, everybody's sad because he's going on the road again. Right. So that's a life that these guys chose. Right. And that's not fake. And that's why wrestlers hate the word fake, because it's not fake how you sacrifice your family life. It's not fake how you pretend not to have injuries when you do. It's not fake when you get potatoed by accident, you get punched in the head by accident, or, somebody hits you with a stiff clothesline and practically takes your head off. Yeah, it's a show, but you're getting hurt every fucking day.
Sorry. Oh yeah. You're getting hammered. Your body's taking bumps. You're getting hammered. Plus also, how about back in the day with the heels taking the heat from the crowd, even after
they would get stabbed.
The tires would. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right.
So I mean, that's not fake. That's your car. Right?
No, none of that. No. Really.
So that was why. Of course, I was a fan as a kid, but once I got around the wrestling business, these people entertained me. They hit something visceral inside of me. And when I saw how dedicated they were to this, I had respect for them. And I would like to think that they were aware that I had that respect for them. And that was why they opened up to me in many cases.
Right. So what was your process, babe? What was your process in take us from, let's say this Billy Graham or Blassie, who's one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, Blassie is an interesting story because it was the end of Freddie Blassie's life.
Correct.
Freddie Blassie died 3 weeks after the book came out. So he was aware that he didn't have long. And he had these stories just bubbling inside of him, his entire life. And, he grew up in an era when he came up in an era when wrestling was closed. You didn't write books. You didn't talk about what went on behind the curtain. And now it was okay to say those things. And so he spoke about the path that his life took. And one of his observations, and this is back in 2002, I think, was nowadays you look at you look at the wrestlers now. Okay, let's go to the last WrestleMania. So the main event was a triple threat. We had Edge, we had Daniel Bryan, and we had Roman Reigns.
Right.
There are three good examples. If professional wrestling didn't exist, all of those guys are bright guys, and those guys would make a living regardless. Those guys would be successful, most likely, in whatever endeavor they chose, even if it had nothing to do with athletics. Freddie Blassie pointed out that in his day, as he put it, it was either wrestling or the pick and shovel. So he had a different point of view about that stuff. And he also came of age in the Carney era, you know, wrestlers
Right.
speak.
That's where it comes from, right?
And he literally, you know, was part of that. And then his career extended all the way to the pay-per-view era. So I looked at Freddie Blassie's book as a document on wrestling history, because he could take you by the hand and bring you through that history. And since wrestling had been closed for so long, it was important for me to now get those words down, because, you know, Freddie Blassie's in the book, John Tolis is in the book, interview. Right. Killer Kowalski's in the book, the Golden Boy Arnold Skolin, the Fabulous Moolah, they're all dead now. Yeah, so, you know, I got those.
Tolis is still, Tolis is dead or no?
Tolis is dead.
Oh, he is, because nobody never, you know, it's funny, just a sidebar, nobody talks about Tolis, the Golden Greek, right?
Yes.
Nobody really talks about him now, even in like when I listened to Jim Cornette's drive through, and I always waiting to hear. Yeah, amazing. And I wait to hear some of the questions. No one ever brings Tolos up.
I'm sure that Jim Cornette could talk extensively about Tolis, because Jim Cornette's a historian, a real historian.
No, he really is.
Yes. So, but yeah, I mean, John Tolis, what a great character. And, you know, he talks. Now, John Tolis was interesting because he still kayfabed a little bit. He couldn't bring himself to say to me that they weren't really fighting, but he would say, in the match, I did this to Freddie and Freddie did this to me, meaning, you know, I smashed him in the head. He did this to me. I threw powder in his eyes. But then he would say, and I loved Freddie, and Freddie and I would hang out at the pool together.
Right. Which is completely contradictory. Yeah, I know.
He's acknowledging that they really cared about each other. They made a lot of money together and they were perfect dance partners. But he couldn't bring himself to say, this was how we worked out the match. Now, in this book, Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, I didn't have anybody kayfabing me. So Joey Janela talks to me about his famous match with Zandig, where Zandig body slammed him off a roof into the flaming back of a pickup truck. He talks about how they worked it out beforehand, how they were at the edge of the roof, and the drainage pipe almost collapsed on them before they did the move. You know, how as they went down, he practically cut his finger off on the barbed wire, how Zandig broke his back, and then how they had a couple of beers in the back and watched some of the other matches before they went to the hospital. So can't call it fake, but there was no hesitation about revealing that. And he even said, you know, back in the day, he would have to kayfabe. And he goes, it's a shame because, you know, some of my best friends are wrestling fans now. He goes, on the indies, wrestling fans sometimes tell the wrestlers about what's going on in other promotions.
Absolutely.
They talk to other wrestlers and they're like, you don't want to work for this guy. He's very stingy with payoffs. So now it's a community where everyone is in on the knowledge that it's a performance. Now, there's still magic that might not be revealed to the public, but nobody is pretending that they hate this other guy when they're out in public.
Correct.
Although MJF, I'm told, goes into character in a hotel lobby.
Right. He's pretty good, actually.
He's great.
He's pretty
good. And as it turns out,
he's pretty good.
His mother
is he from Long Island?
he's from Long Island, but his mother, Nina Weissman, I shouldn't even be saying her name. She went to Bayside High School at the same time I did. And, I remember like seeing like, it was like a picture of Passover or something. And just looking at the picture of the family, it's like, Jesus, your son is MJF?
That's crazy. What happened with the biography of the Sheik? It was unreleased or
it's unreleased.
What's the story with that?
A fan recently told me that they procured a copy that must have been circulating around, like an advanced copy. I didn't even know these existed. I actually worked on that book twice. I was first assigned the book in 2008 when the Sheik was on the Howard Stern show. And that's when
I follow him now, by the way, on Twitter. He's hilarious. Absolutely hilarious.
And that was when he was at his wackiest.
Yes.
And so there was Howard Stern stuff in there, along with, wrestling stuff and crazy drug stories, crazy feuds, like personal feuds with people like Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior.
Right.
Great stories about him and Bruno beating up some of the Pittsburgh Steelers because they disrespected Bruno backstage. And, but a lot of stories about negative things. So, but he had a crack problem at the time, the Iron Sheik. And so when I wrote the book, it was a WWE imprint on Simon and Schuster. Simon and Schuster went through it. They loved the book. WWE went through it and they're like, it's not really a redeeming story because even though we don't acknowledge that he's still a drug addict, it was pretty clear that he was.
Fucked up, right. Mm-hmm.
And so I got paid, he got paid, and they shelved the book and we thought that was the end. And then a few years later, he had kicked crack and he had reconciled with his wife. And I did a story on him for Playboy magazine, and which Mike Edison got for me. He told the editor that I'd be the guy to write the story.
Mike Edison, you're the star here. You're a star, Mike Edison.
So I did that story, and it spoke about him kicking drugs. And I interviewed his wife. I interviewed his daughters, and someone at WWE saw it and they're like, I think we may want to put this book out now, so now ECW Press, the people who published this book and the book I'm currently writing, they said, yeah, we'll publish the book. And ECW is for Encyclopedia of Canadian Writing, by the way. It's not
not Extreme Championship Wrestling.
And so now I rewrite the book, and we mention that he's rehabbed, and we tone a couple of things down.
Sure.
But not many. And now the book goes through the rounds. ECW Press is very happy. I'm told many people at WWE were very happy and very amused with it. And I'm up in Stamford now with Steve Pantaleo, who was my co-author on the encyclopedias, but he's in charge of consumer products at WWE. And he and I are going through photos, of the Iron Sheik and photos that they procured from PWI. And so we're like in a great mood. And then he calls me and he goes, somebody very high up, it wasn't Vince, but someone extremely high up, but not Vince, looked at the book and just said, how does this book help our brand? There's drug stories, there's stories about groupies being clotheslined and smuggling 8 balls of coke over the border. And, you're
not the right time.
It's a public company, this isn't the image that you're peddling. And so once again, I got paid. So I got paid for the book twice. And never been published. Okay. And it's a fascinating book. And honestly, I wish it were published because I would want the Iron Sheik's real story told and not just the crazy drug stories. What a dedicated athlete he was when he was back in Iran. The torment he felt, one of his daughters was actually murdered. and the guilt that he felt about that and not being around a lot. And funny stories where that his daughters told me where he would be in the gym and people would say, I want to work out with you. And he'd make people exercise till they threw up. And, just great stories,
Right.
and he loved cold showers. And one of his daughters said they would go, I think, to Stone Mountain, Georgia, to the park. They'd be having a picnic. And there was a freezing cold waterfall, and he would start like basically bathing in the waterfall. And one of the daughters said people would gather around. They'd go, who's that maniac bathing in the water? Oh my God, it's the Iron Sheik. So those are great stories. And I'm sorry that the world, won't get a chance to hear all of them.
They will. They're going to. But I maybe just right now. I mean, what's coming out. What people want to come out, what they won't.
What I always say when Triple H and Stephanie's daughters are running the place, one of them will come across it and go, let's put it out.
Let's do it. Right. Exactly. So, what was a pivotal moment for you in your career that you could say changed your life or changed the path?
Well, certainly being at the first WrestleMania and running into Ed Raschuti, who was the editor of the magazine, was a pivotal moment for me because he said, why don't you come work for us?
Tell us about that.
I wasn't full-time in the office. I never was. I was always a freelancer.
Sure.
But I was now with the wrestlers at least every 3 weeks, say. And so I got to know them. And by getting to know them, that led to me writing several books. And I recall the first few books that came out, I didn't write. Mick Foley wrote his own book. And I think The Rock had a book that came out. And I was feeling a little jealous, a little left out. I'm like, I could do this. And then Freddie Blassie was ready to do his book. And then I was asked to do that. And once I got on that track, I did Blassie's book, then Ric Flair's book, then Superstar Billy Graham's book. And now I wasn't just a guy who wrote for wrestling magazines. I was a wrestling author, and I was already an author. Right. But in the world of wrestling, the fact that I could write a book and it wouldn't be a crisis was, what was acknowledged. Now, there were plenty of people who co-wrote books with wrestlers because they were close with them, but they didn't know how to organize and construct a book. And I knew how to do that.
As being a writer, being an author.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And doing something long form like that. And that also comes from working in TV and doing documentaries. And that's how I look at my wrestling books, as bound documentaries.
Amazing. Great story. I have any story that really sticks out as a crazy, funny, let's say wrestling story, because we're on that. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, wrestling stories are always the crazy and the funny ones.
Right.
But I just wrote about this for Inside the Ropes magazine, and I'm sure there are better stories. But I was just on that show about Rowdy Roddy Piper, and the Iron Sheik had told me a story that when they were working in the Carolinas, him and Piper were in a car together, and these Iranian people invited them over for a party. And he said, in Iran, where we're religious Shiite Muslims, a party means grapes and pistachio nuts and dates. He goes, over there, it was Percocet and Quaaludes and cocaine. And they were, Roddy Piper actually had a mortar and pestle. He was grinding them
crushing
them. And he's like licking his fingers and giggling maniacally. And they get pulled over on the road. And the cops are questioning Piper, and the Iron Sheik comes out of the car, and he slips one of the cops $500. And the cop says, he looks at Roddy Piper and he says, I'm only doing this, Roddy, because I love you. And, there's lots of stories like that. And I'm sure I'll think of 10 better ones.
That's a good story. No, I like that. What's your current feeling on on what's going on now at wrestling wise WWE, AEW, Impact, some of the Outlaw, Invictus. I have a friend that I'm not a friend, but I know somebody who's actually an Outlaw wrestler. His name is Big Trouble Ben Bishop. He's a 7-foot guy, and trying to get some exposure. But what's your take on what's going on now?
Well, it's a good time. It's funny because my book that I'm writing now is about wrestling during the time of COVID. And I begin the book in like chapter 2. I say this, like 2020 was supposed to be the best year to be a wrestling fan. And I say, and maybe it was, because even with COVID, you had the institutionalization of the cinematic match that came from WWE. You had those 2 cinematic matches at WrestleMania last year. You had The Undertaker and AJ Styles, and you had that Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena and The Fiend, Bray Wyatt. And then you had the Stadium Stampede in AEW, which was cinematic. Obviously, one guy did not suplex the other guy for 100 yards across the field. They kept cutting away, and each time you saw it, they were further down the field together. So you had that. You had the creation of the Thunderdome, which are these giant LED screens that surrounded the wrestlers in the ring. And, I've heard for years about how WWE is out of touch. They're the old-fashioned company, but they were pretty innovative during this.
So you're talking more, though, really production capability there.
Production capability is one of them, but you also have great talent. In AEW, you have an alternative which is funded by a billionaire.
Yeah, Tony.
And it's not like WCW, where it was Ted Turner's money and other people running the company. Tony Khan, Shahid Khan's son, is running the company. This is his company.
Right.
And his entire life has dreamed of having a wrestling company. And I don't know if you saw this past week, they had the Blood and Guts match, which was a variation of the War Games match. But, that was an alternative to what you see on WWE. And NXT is still very good. So, that's WWE's third brand. And then when I was just at WrestleMania, there weren't dozens and dozens of indie promotions having shows the same week. But, Game Changer Wrestling in Jersey, which I
Game Changer, right?
About.
Yeah.
Those guys had a gathering called The Collective, and they weren't the only ones, but they were shows where several indie promotions were in one location and fans could go.
Right. I know Invictus is another company that's doing pretty well.
Yeah, there was ICW out of Queens, the guy who owns Wrestling Universe on Francis Lewis Boulevard.
The store. Yeah,
the store.
Of course,
Jack, he, that's his promotion that he's involved with, and they had a series of shows during WrestleMania week. So on the indie scene, there are still, it still offers a vibrant alternative. And so, there are opportunities to be had there. And even if, look, COVID knocked a lot of people on their ass. Definitely. And, people weren't getting bookings as much. But like, I spoke to a guy for my next book named Danhausen, who's a very colorful wrestler who's now signed with Ring of Honor. And because we live in the era we do, he was able to generate revenue from Patreon and sell merchandise. And actually pay his bills with this in a time where he was inactive.
Yeah, people are doing that.
So it's still, I think when we look back on this period in wrestling, we will look at it very fondly, even though sometimes us being in our 60s, we look at wrestling as maybe not being the way it was during the Bruno era. But things, things change, things evolve. And, I didn't like every era in the, in the course of my life. And some of the eras I reminisce about are eras when I was bored for 3/4 of the time when I was watching it.
Gotcha. What's coming up for Keith Greenberg? tell us what you got coming up. You want to promote something? You want to let us know what's cooking?
I remember one day I just had this flashback. You were working as a bartender in Great Neck, right?
Millie's place in Great Neck. Absolutely. Shout out to Millie.
Bennett Schwartz worked there too, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think you were driving home from work and I was driving on Northern Boulevard, and we saw each other and rolled down the window and shouted a few things to, a few greetings to each other.
No doubt. Great call on that. Great memory, by the way. I mean, Bennett. Wow, that's a great name from the past. Yeah, he worked as a bartender as well. I was a waiter there. Yeah, those were the days, buddy. Those were the days. Yeah. So what's coming up for you? What's cooking?
Okay, so what's coming up? Well, I should tell people. Still, this is still for sale. Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution.
Right. We're going to put all the descriptions and everything where you get in the content section. Comment section
but you could go online and get that. Good. I was in a Barnes and Noble recently, and I saw there were 2 copies over there. Beautiful. But I'd say at this stage you might as well order it online. And then my next book will be it's actually going to be called Follow the Buzzards, which is a term that Bray Wyatt used in a promo. And it's right now the working title is Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Time of COVID-19. And so that's what I'm working on. That's not going to be out till 2022, even though I'm making really good timing on it. By the time we acquire all the photos, they also have a release schedule. And I think it'll still be relevant. I was worried because I'm like, I'll be done with that in a month or two. And then I just read a book chronicling the 2016 election. And now it's 5 years later. And even though that, it still resonated, it didn't feel like an old book. So just like if you read a book about the death of WCW, it still is a piece of history. And I think even though I'm writing this book in the middle of the COVID era, I think 5 years from now, that book will still mean something because, it's grabbing a period of time. So that's what I'm working on right now.
I love it. So we want to say thank you so much. Grind and Pivot, pivotal moments that changed everything. Keith, Elliot Greenberg, a pleasure. I wish you only good things. I'm hoping I'm going to see you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Louis.
Closing doors, please.